Welcome to the first episode of our Share PLM mini series called Share the Spotlight. This is going to be a series of mini episodes in which we're going to introduce you to members of our Share PLM team so you can get a better idea of who we are, what we do, and also where we come from. So I'm going to hand over to our guest today, Jamie Vaughan, for her to give us a little introduction to herself.
Thanks, Maria. I'm excited to be your first guest. So, way back in undergrad days, I did an undergrad in new media technology and art history and worked in museums a bit. And after realizing that it was my nighttime gig as a nanny that gave me the real joy, I found a job as a teaching assistant and fell in love with education. So I earned a DC teaching fellowship and moved down to DC and taught there for 4 years. And after that, I moved to London and I taught there for 4 years. And along the route, I picked up a master's in policy and practice in education from University College London. And I specialize in children between the ages of, say, 3 and 7. So the younger crowd they're my crew. And after that, or sort of alongside that, my mom passed away, and it made me really reassess what I was doing with my life because she died quite young. And I thought, if we only have a short amount of time on Earth, am I using it the way I want to use it?
Definitely.
So I returned to the US for a little while to be closer to family and received some additional training in working with children with additional needs. And then I went traveling, as you do. So I backpacked Asia for a while and landed in Australia eventually, where my qualifications didn't go through, and so I couldn't teach. So I started off doing one-to-one aid work for children with additional needs, and then fell into education research. From there, I was working for the social benefit company that I loved, and I loved the purpose behind, but I just felt that it was very unorganized all the time and could be better. And I became interested in operations organization and in business management. And I sort of self-taught. I got into a businesswoman's book club and read a bunch of different materials and slowly started working on operations, moving my team into project management systems. And I loved it. And so from that point onwards, everything else I've done has sort of gone alongside assisting organizations in that way.
Yeah. Wow.
So yeah. So like all of my jobs since that time have slowly built up to where I am now.
That's incredible. You have such a diverse and kind of dynamic career path, Jamie. It's so interesting to hear all about it. And I think what really resonates with me as well is the kind of different routes and paths that you've taken. And when one thing hasn't worked out, you haven't let that stress you out. You've simply gone to the next available opportunity that you thought you could work towards. And I think that's really great because I think so many people would, when one door closes, that they feel is their next most available or reasonable next step forward, they would simply just freak out, panic, and think, where do I go next? Whereas you really pivot towards kind of where the open doors are and opportunities. Do you think that having that kind of more open approach to finding a job and a career path has really helped you get to where you are today?
So yes, I think though that mindset, it comes from a couple of different pieces, that you don't necessarily start off your career in that way, thinking, oh, I can meet my values in many different fields and in many different ways. And the younger you are, it seems the more we're sort of filtering people into a specific career field or a specific type of role even. So I think that not only does it help to, for example, my parents were immigrants, and as long as you were working, that was the most important part. And it was less about what you were doing and more about that you were part of something. And so going into it with that sort of thought process helped. But genuinely, I think in certain ways, it's finding your joy along the way. So for example, when I found out, I walked into that classroom as a teaching assistant and fell in love with teaching. And also finding your values along the way, realizing that while it gives me great joy to help a 3-year-old learn how to explore the world, I'm also really happy with assisting, an organization in moving into a system that benefits them at the end of the day, at making people feel their purpose in their job
And do you think you would have ended up where you are now, in the role you have now as a change management consultant at Share PLM, if you hadn't had such a diverse kind of background and experience?
Honestly, I had never even heard of the position change management consultant back when I started in university. And I'm sure you know, when you say the word consultant, it seems to mean anything these days.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
And back when I was working in education, the word consultant was simply, oh, that person works in a professional capacity. So it was really a step by step guiding of the universe, sort of. I mean, I would have had no idea this is where I would have ended up.
And I think that raises a really great point as well. I think it also really sums up Share PLM and the people that work here, because so many of us, we didn't go to university necessarily and study a specific kind of area of academia, and then that led us to this point. A lot of us have such diverse backgrounds, whether it is in the more traditional kind of engineering or business, but we also have people who are kind of psychologists, backgrounds in teaching, all of these areas that traditionally you wouldn't look at that their career path and think they're going to end up consulting. So I think having those transferable skills from past experiences is so important, and I think that's ultimately what's led you to do such an amazing job where you are now.
Well, thank you for that. I do feel that we're surrounded by people at Share who see the opportunities when life changes.
Mm.
So when you speak to different team members about, oh, what did you do during the pandemic? You know, many of my friends just survived. And meanwhile, my colleagues at Share are similar to me in that, you know, I went out and I got a master's in psychology during the pandemic because, you know, it wasn't like we were going to socialize in the evenings. And I have colleagues who, you know, moved countries or gained a new qualification, and the mindset of being surrounded by people who see the silver lining in a change in the situation, I think really speaks to the sort of culture.
And what would you say are your biggest takeaways from your experience in education, for example, or in operations management?
I think for me, it started with a values transfer before it became a skill set transfer. It started with thinking about what's important to me on a day-to-day basis and the many ways that can look. I tend to focus on connection and growth or exploring the world alongside someone or alongside an organization, and realizing that that could look many different ways leads you to start thinking about how situations you've previously been in could be transferable. So, for example, something that's very important in, you know, in education or in psychology and in change management consulting is making sure people have a safe space to experience change.
Yeah.
And a safe space can be created by a relationship or by information and making sure you have all the information to make the decisions you need. Or it can be created by a community, you know, creating a community that you can ask questions and not worry about how you appear in that moment, because it's not about climbing a ladder, it's about growing as an individual. I think that seeing those skills as being something more than just a soft skill set and rather a set of values that guide you,
Yeah,
is an important part of why I think it works. And I think it's why, for example, I work with some very different personalities, and there's this cohesion that happens despite very different working styles and very different working mindsets and very different working cultures. We're all from very, I mean, our backgrounds are very all over.
yeah,
And it's that ability to sort of focus on what's important.
for sure. Finding a common ground.
Mm-hmm. That I think it really shines through.
I completely agree. And that actually was something I wanted to ask you, because you, compared to, you know, a lot of people, not many people will have had the opportunity to work across the US, in Australia, in the UK. And I was going to ask, do you think that experience of working across cultures has helped you work in very much international projects? So with global organizations, with teams spread out across the world, do you think that that experience has helped you?
Absolutely. For me, it begins with having worked with 3-year-olds, and 3-year-olds break you of any assumptions to
Yeah.
start with. You need to walk into the conversation understanding that you have no idea where they're coming from that day. because they can't really communicate it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you move around the world, you start to realize that actually, as you're interacting with everyone, everyone's coming with such a rich personal history and background that there's no way you could understand where they're coming from on any given day, simply because, for example, you share a language or a cultural background. It's about opening the door to whatever they are bringing on that moment or in that day, and having that flexibility to understand that assumptions are one of the biggest barriers to communication.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think if you go into a situation assuming how somebody should react, you're always going to be disappointed because no one's ever going to have the same initial reaction or kind of work mindset as you were talking about as you expect. So I think you kind of really epitomize, being flexible, being open to various ways of working and styles. So I think that's really great. And before we wrap up, we've spoken a lot about your kind of very much diverse career path to get you to where you are now. And for people who are listening who maybe are unsure of where they are going, are unsure of their career path, they're not sure if the job they are in now is kind of where they want to end up. What advice would you give them to kind of finding their career and finding their passion?
I would say that it's important to figure out your values and then be open to how you meet them, how you live them. And to also remember that your values and your priorities might be different. So there might be times where, for example, you really value your career, but this is a moment to focus on your home life. Or there might be times where you really value getting things done in the most efficient way possible, but you can see the benefit of extending a project to have an open dialogue for a longer amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
So there's times where your priorities and your values aren't going to align exactly the way you would like them to, and being open to that shifting within yourself and finding different opportunities for exploring that with yourself is important. And also think about how you can reframe your current situation. So, for example, if you are not happy with your current role, to think about, well, why did I want it initially? What could I focus on during this time here to leave me better than I arrived, or to leave the people around me better than when I got to them, while you figure out what's next? And to be open to change. It's so scary to be looking at a big change in your life, or to be looking at financial insecurity caused by such a change.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to remember that, one, there's no guarantees. So you could be in the best job ever and love it so very much. And if tomorrow, for example, the pandemic rolls around and therefore your job shut down, that's not anything you can do about that moment. And what you can do is you can see that there's other opportunities to do something you love or you enjoy, or there's other ways, for example, to do a job. For example, I did IT support, and yes, you do ask people to turn it off and turn it back on again quite a bit.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the parts I liked about that role were helping doctors' offices adapt to using new software that benefited their patients.
Mm-hmm.
And when you focus on that, in that case, it was my value of helping and connecting.
Yeah.
I can survive the 8,000 times a day I also had to ask someone to turn something on and back off.
Definitely. I completely agree, Jamie. And I think one of my biggest takeaways from this discussion is that you don't have to love every aspect of your job. But it's about finding kind of the small passions or the small wins within your day-to-day activities, and then taking those to kind of build on when you're looking at potentially other opportunities, other roles, but not necessarily thinking so long term about where you ultimately want to end up, but looking at, this is where I am now. What do I enjoy doing? Here's a potential opportunity that would allow me to expand on these kind of current passions and current interests. As you've shown, you've had so many different kind of jobs in different areas, and ultimately it's led you to a point where you're able to encapsulate all of your kind of mini interests and passions into one job. So thank you so much for sharing your kind of career journey with us. And yes, if our listeners have any kind of questions or anything they'd like us to discuss going forward, please just leave us a comment and we will get to that.